If you want to level up as a graphic designer and really take yourself from amateur to pro, there's really one skill set that I think every person has to dive into, and that is the world of typography. But honestly, this whole space can feel pretty overwhelming, especially if you're not going to a traditional school. There is an entire litany of verbiage and vocabulary and terminology that comes along with type. And it feels like there's all of these rules and structures that everyone knows, and it was invented by some German professor in the 1800s, and you're just supposed to know all of this stuff when you sit down in Illustrator trying to make a poster, right? Well, the easiest way that I have found to really get my head around the good rules and understanding of typography is through books. So today I pulled my favorites off my bookshelf, and I'm going to go through my favorite graphic design books for typography. So if that sounds like your particular brand of nerdery, let's dive in. First off, if we haven't met, I'm Janelle. I've been a freelance graphic designer for 15 years now, and this is my space on the internet to talk about design and freelance life and creativity and how to have a creative life without losing your soul. And sometimes I'm just going to nerd out about books. So if that sounds like your bag, hit the subscribe button because I would love to hang out again. So this is actually the second installment of what I'm considering now my Designer's Library series, which basically just means that occasionally I'm going to nerd out about my favorite design books in a particular little subcategory. So if you want to, you might want to start with my first installment, which was 5 books that I would recommend to any beginner designer who's just wanting to get their feet wet in design. The books that I think are a good starting point. And I'm actually going to repeat a few of these because I dove into type a little bit on there. So I'm going to reference that at some point, so you might want to go back and watch it. So I think a good place to start is books about what type actually is. So the first 2 I'm going to recommend kind of read like real books that you can actually read your way through. One of my favorite overviews of what type even is called Just My Type by Simon Garfield. And if the thought of cozying up with an actual book to read about the history and idea of type and letter forms and where they came from and the printing press and all of that actually sounds like a good time to you, this is a great book. I think it's a really engaging read. It's written like a series of short stories where each chapter tells the history of a particular typeface or a typographer, or how a particular style was invented. Because each story is a little bite-sized chunk, I find it really easy to kind of pick up and dive into little bits, and the stories stick with me in this sort of narrative structure a lot more than they would in a more traditional type textbook, which we will get to. But I really love this format. If you've ever wanted to learn about the slightly salacious history of one of my favorite typefaces, Mrs. Eves, it's in here. So is the history of the interrobang, which is a mark I loved so much I got tattooed on me. So these are really good little nuggets if you just kind of want to dive in to some of the culture and the history of this space and become a bona fide type nerd. It's a fun place to start. Along the same lines, but slightly more academic, is the masterpiece by Erik Spiekermann, Stop Stealing Sheep. This is actually one of the first books that was assigned to me as a textbook in my first Intro to Type class in the Stone Age of 2005. This also reads like a book, and it's broken up into different sections about how to think about type, how to understand it, how to look at it properly, how to use things well. He is very authoritative, very German, and very funny. He gives a lot of graphic examples about the essence of type and how type should make us feel, how to use it to bring out emotional responses. And throughout the book, there's this running sidebar in pink text that is utterly hilarious if you want really snarky commentary all the way through. It really reads like he's giving a lecture in his Intro to Type class, which I would pay good money to attend. So if you want to feel like you're in school, this is a good option.
Okay, editing Janelle here. As I was looking up the links for this video, I discovered that the entire book is actually available online for free through the Creative Commons license by Google Fonts. So go on there and read the whole book. No excuses. You should read it. I'll put the link in the description. I'll put all the links in the description, but that one especially. Okay, back to the video.
Another in the meta understand the world of typography sort of space is Why Fonts Matter by Sarah Hyndman. This is another one that's very visual. She uses a lot of graphic examples, but she really breaks down what is this whole field? Why does it matter to you? How do we actually use this well? It feels really practical and engaging and modern. And she really takes it from something that feels very like highbrow and academic to something you can really get your head around really easily. So if this whole world feels a little intimidating, I would really recommend this one as a good starting point. Moving slightly into the more handbooky territory is the Typography Idea Book, one of the myriad excellent resources made by Stephen Heller. This idea book thing is actually a whole series. This is the graphic design one where he uses the same format. And basically, instead of it being instructions on how to use type or an overview of history or specific examples of type sets, it's more about inspiration for ways that type can be used. So he has inspiration examples of how to use type with personality or how to be inspired by different time periods, different techniques or optical illusions or concepts that you can apply, and then he gives really visual examples of what that could look like. This is the kind of book that I consider evergreen because when I'm feeling a little bit stuck on something, it's the kind of thing that I can flip through and just get an idea of like, oh, I've not tried that kind of a technique. That could be an interesting approach to this project that I'm currently wrestling with. I feel like these kinds of books are gold to sort of spark an idea when you're feeling a little bit stuck. So this is the kind of stuff I come back to a lot. I love this series in general and might be worth looking at overall. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this next one because I actually covered it at length in my first video. I think it's a really good starting point to get your head around type, which is why I put it in that video. But it just feels really wrong to have a whole video specifically about typography and not mention Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. I am a fangirl of Miss Ellen's, and I really love the way that she explains type. This is the very first book that I ever bought about design when I was a teenager, playing with the idea of becoming a graphic designer, and I think she does an excellent job of really breaking down the whole field and walking you through, like a class, how to get your head around type conceptually, and then how to apply it really tangibly. If you're going to do one book as an introduction to type, it should probably be this one. Likewise, I mentioned this in my last video, so I'm just going to breeze through it. But after you have a general idea about type, you really need to dive into grid systems. This is the kind of mathy, scary, technical part of typography that can feel really overwhelming. I think it's the piece that art school does the best job of helping you understand. And if you're DIYing your own design school, this is the part that the imposter syndrome can kind of pop up in, because it feels like this complicated world that you don't necessarily have your head around. So dive into books. The seminal starting point on this is grid systems. It is somewhat intimidatingly written in both English and German all the way through the book, but it really helps you understand what are grid systems, what are examples of different kinds of systems and layouts that you can use, how do you use the structure to your advantage, how do you use it appropriately, and it's not that hard to dive into. And once you get it, you kind of can't unsee it. You start seeing grids everywhere like you're in the Matrix. And this is a really good way to do that. If the thought of the scary German is a little bit much for you, a good entry point to this is making and breaking the grid. I would call this the spiritual successor to grid systems for someone who is maybe a little bit scared of all the German. They spend a little bit less time on the mathy conceptual part of it and more giving you actual examples about what different systems look like, how grids are broken up, and then a lot of examples of those systems being used in real pieces so you can actually see, oh, this is what that actually looks like, and here's how I could actually do something similar. It helps it feel less technical and easier to start actually recognizing these things in the real world. And then the whole second section of the book is how to break the grid, how to ditch some of the rules or use them more interestingly, how to be a little bit less structured in your layouts, but still doing it well with some thought and theory behind it. It's really useful if you feel like all of this is a little bit too limiting and you want to see examples of how people have kind of broken out of this big German kind of concept into something that still feels like there's a rhythm and a sense and an order to it. And that's really the difference between I'm just going to move some things around on the screen and call it design to feeling like the things that you're doing have purpose and intention and a sense of logic behind them. It gives you a real sense of confidence that you're not just kind of willy-nilly, but you actually know what you're doing, because you do. All right, now we're really diving into design nerd space. If you made it this far down into the stack, it's because you're really enjoying the whole world of typography. Not just because it's something you need to tick off, but because you want to become a font nerd. There is something fun about being able to quickly identify fonts out in the wild or be able to rattle off the names of all the different parts of a type language. So this last piece of the stack is really if you want to dive in and like make yourself a member of the club. The really nerdy club. One of my favorites of these is The Anatomy of Type by Stephen Coles. This is exactly what it sounds like. He spends a ton of time on the anatomy of typefaces, on all of the terminologies and the classifications that we use in this sort of secret language. So if you want to throw around words like ligature and substrate and swashes and brackets, this is the book for you. Beyond just like rote memorization, what I love about this book is he really dives into why it is that certain fonts feel a certain way and other ones don't. We talk about serif and sans serif fonts, right? But why is it that some serif fonts feel really like cold and academic and some feel really like friendly and cozy, almost feminine? You could have a sans serif font that feels super robotic and futuristic, or something that feels like it was written by a child. Why is that? Well, he really dives into why. He gives great examples of different classifications in serif and sans serif fonts, and he actually gets into the specific elements of a character that help create the characterization of a typeface. So it's not just about recognizing, oh, that's a this thing and this is a that thing, but why these things make you feel that way. And then most of the book is giving examples of specific typefaces in those different classifications, and then pointing out the specific elements that define that kind of type, so you can start recognizing them in other typefaces. It's really eye-opening when you start actually granularly looking at how typefaces were made. And if you have any interest in actually designing type, this is invaluable because it helps you actually start looking at letter forms and deciding, okay, what kind of character do I want to give this? What aspects do I want to highlight here? And what decisions do I want to make that will lead to a certain feeling in your type? It's definitely granular, but I think it's completely awesome. And I've never seen another book laid out quite like this. Another one in this sort of encyclopedia category is The Designer's Dictionary of Type by Sean Adams. This is another one that's a part of a larger series. Hold on. His companion one is all about color, which I might pull out in a future video. Stay tuned. It's similar to this book in that he goes through the different classifications of type, but instead of going into the granular details of each letter form and talking about individual anatomy, he gives examples of what each one looks like in the wild. So if you want to see examples of how Garamond gets used in posters and books, you can do that. It's hard sometimes when you're just looking at a typeface to actually envision how it gets used well and what it can look like in the wild, and this book really takes these flat typefaces and puts them into real-world context. This is the kind of book that I just like to have around because it gives you a good frame of reference in the future if you just want to flip through and get inspiration for something. Also, like, how good do those look on a bookshelf? All right, I've saved the behemoth for last. This, my friends, is the visual history of type. Could you knock someone out with it? Probably. But if you want a full visual timeline of the history of typography from the printing press to now, this is invaluable. He literally starts in 1450 and then gives you little windows all the way through the timeline. But instead of it being just a giant block of text, he gives you the visual of a specific specimen from that time, so you can actually see the letter forms evolving over time. It's super cool. He gives you all the characteristics and the details about a specific font, but then a little story about how that font continued the progression of type history moving forward. You think from the outside that this thing is going to put you to sleep, but the whole thing is actually this visual timeline in a way that I think is incredibly engaging. And the little stories are actually like little bite-sized morsels that you can tuck away for a rainy day. And if you're the particular brand of nerd who likes to pull out obscure type facts at cocktail parties, this is a treasure trove. So yes, this thing is massive. You could definitely ward off a burglar with it. It's certainly expensive, but it's one of those things that you just want to have, or at least I do. And if you're looking for a gift for a particularly nerdy type fanatic in your life, so these were just some of my favorites in the world of typography. Believe it or not, there were actually more, so let me know if you want me to do a part 2. And I'm going to keep diving into the world of design books occasionally and highlighting things that I think are just great. So subscribe if you want to see the next one. It's probably going to be about color. And you should really check out the first video in this series, because it really gives more of an overview as a starting point if you just kind of want to dip your toe in. Happy reading!